A routine traffic stop becomes a race against time. One officer's instinct changes everything. Officer Daniel Mitchell never expected his Thursday evening patrol to turn his world upside down. But when he spots a silver Honda Civic rolling through, a stop sign near Riverside District, that split-second decision to flick on his lights leads him to a discovery that would haunt him forever. One look at the little girl in the back seat, and he knows something is terribly wrong. The autumn. Rain fell steadily over Pine Valley, coating the streets with a glossy sheen that reflected the glow of street lamps coming to life in the early evening. Officer Daniel Mitchell adjusted his windshield wipers, watching as they swept away the persistent drizzle that had been falling since his shift began 2 hours ago. The clock on his dashboard read 6:32 p.m. His coffee, now lukewarm in its cup, holder remained mostly untouched. 15 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and tonight something felt different. The usual Thursday evening traffic was lighter than normal, perhaps due to the weather, and an unusual quietness had settled over his regular patrol route through the Riverside District. Dan, as his fellow officers called him, kept his eyes sharp. As he cruised past the aging storefronts and family homes that lined Oakwood Boulevard, the rain created a hypnotic pattern on his windshield, but he remained alert, his trained gaze scanning each intersection, each shadow. His radio occasionally crackled with routine calls. A noise complaint near the Old Mill District, a fender bender by the shopping center. Nothing out of the ordinary. He'd just passed the corner diner, its neon sign casting a warm glow through the misty evening, when his attention was drawn to movement at the upcoming intersection. A silver Honda Civic rolled through the stop sign at Cedar Street, its driver either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the law. The car's headlights cut through the rain, illuminating its path as it continued down the street at a measured pace. Dan sighed, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch Unit 247. I'm initiating a traffic stop on a silver Honda Civic near Cedar and Oakwood. Plate number incoming." He flipped on his lights, watching as the Civic's brake lights illuminated, the car pulling over smoothly to the curb, near Gateway gas station. The scene seemed routine enough, the kind of stop he'd made thousands of times before. But as Dan stepped out of his patrol car, the rain hitting his uniform with a soft patter, something felt off. He couldn't quite place it, but years of experience had taught him to pay attention to these subtle warnings. His boots splashed quietly in the puddles as he approached the driver's side window, flashlight in hand. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a well-dressed man in his late 40s. Everything about him seemed carefully put together, from his pressed collared shirt to his neatly combed, gray-streaked hair, too put together for this time of evening. "Good evening, officer," the man said, his voice carrying an unnaturally pleasant tone. "Is there a problem?" Dan's flashlight beam moved systematically through the car's interior, a habit born from years of experience. That's when he saw her. A little girl in the back seat, no more than 8 years old. She sat perfectly still, her small hands clutching a worn backpack in her lap. Her eyes, wide and alert, met his for just a moment before quickly looking away. Something about that brief glance made Dan's cop instincts flare. The girl's posture was too rigid, her silence too complete. Most kids her age would be curious about a police stop, maybe even excited, but this child seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. "Sir, you rolled through that stop sign back there," Dan said, keeping his tone professional while his mind raced. "License and registration, please." The man reached for his glove compartment with fluid efficiency. "Of course, officer. My mistake entirely. We're just heading home from my daughter's piano lesson. Running a bit late, you know how it goes." As the man handed over his documents, Dan noticed the girl flinch slightly at the word daughter. It was subtle, barely a twitch, but it was there. The rain continued to fall around them, and in The distance, thunder rolled ominously. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Dan asked, directing his question to the child while maintaining peripheral awareness of the driver. The girl's eyes darted to the man before she answered in a whisper so soft it nearly vanished in the sound of falling rain. "Sarah." The driver quickly interjected, "Sophie. Her name is Sophie Wilson. She's just shy around strangers." Dan's internal alarm bells rang louder. The girl had responded to Sarah, but the man called her Sophie. And her reaction to his question, that quick, fearful glance at the driver, spoke volumes. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Wilson," Dan said, maintaining his professional demeanor while his mind worked through possibilities. "But I'd like to ask you a few more questions, if you don't mind." The rain intensified, drumming against the car's roof as tension built in the small space between them. Dan could feel it, that crucial moment when routine transforms into something else entirely, something that would change lives forever. The pounding rain intensified as Officer Dan Mitchell studied James Wilson's driver's license, his mind racing through possibilities. Something about Wilson's polished demeanor felt rehearsed, like an actor playing a role he'd practiced too many times. The little girl in the back seat hadn't moved an inch, her knuckles white against the worn backpack she clutched. "Mr. Wilson, where did you say you were coming from?" Dan asked, angling his body to keep both the driver and the child in view. "Piano lessons, over at the Riverside Music Academy." Wilson's response came too quickly, too smoothly. "We go every Thursday." Dan nodded, making a mental note of how the girl's shoulders tensed at the mention of piano lessons. "And you live where exactly?" "Pine Creek Estates, just off Mountain View Drive." Wilson gestured vaguely toward the north. "About 15 minutes from here." The rain drummed against Dan's jacket as he processed this information. Pine Creek Estates was in the opposite direction of where the car had been heading. He kept his face neutral, years of experience helping him maintain a calm exterior while his instincts screamed that something was very wrong. "Mind if I speak with your daughter for a moment?" Dan asked, his tone deliberately casual. "Department policy, you understand. When minors are in the vehicle." A flicker of something, anger, fear, crossed Wilson's face before his pleasant mask slipped back into place. "Is that really necessary? She's tired and we're already running late." "It'll just take a minute," Dan insisted, already moving toward the rear door. He opened it slowly, crouching down to eye level with the girl. Rain spattered against his back as he offered her a gentle smile. "Hey there. I'm Officer Mitchell, but you can call me Dan. What's your name?" The girl's eyes darted to the rearview mirror where Wilson watched intently. "Sophie," she whispered, but the name sounded foreign on her tongue, as if she were trying it out for the first time. "Sophie," Dan repeated softly. "That's a pretty name. How old are you?" 8. Her voice trembled slightly. "And you just had piano lessons?" Dan asked, noting how she unconsciously shook her head before catching herself and nodding. Wilson's voice cut through the rain. "Officer, really, we need to get going. I'm happy to pay the fine for the stop sign." Dan held up a hand, his focus remaining on the girl. "Sophie, can you show me what you learned at piano today?" Her eyes widened with panic, fingers clutching the backpack tighter. In that moment, Dan saw something that made his blood run cold, a small tear in the backpack's fabric where something that looked like a note had been hastily stuffed inside. "Mr. Wilson, I'm going to need both of you to step out of the vehicle," Dan said, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. But before he could call for backup, Wilson gunned the engine. The Honda lurched forward, the open rear door nearly knocking Dan off balance. He stumbled back, already sprinting toward his patrol car, as the Civic's taillights disappeared into the rainy darkness. "Dispatch, Unit 247. I've got a silver Honda Civic fleeing from a traffic stop, heading east on Oakwood Boulevard. Plate number Charlie 79 Victor Echo 3. Male driver, approximately 50, with a young female passenger, possible kidnapping situation. Dan's voice cut through the radio as he pursued the fleeing vehicle, his siren piercing the quiet evening. The chase wound through Pine Valley's rain-slicked streets, the Civic taking sharp turns through residential areas in an attempt to lose him. Dan's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he followed, knowing that every second mattered. The girl's frightened eyes haunted him. He'd seen that look before, in other cases that had ended tragically. "All units be advised," dispatch crackled through his radio. "Possible matching Amber Alert from Portland Metro. Sarah Anderson, age 8, reported missing 3 days ago. Suspect vehicle matches description. Sarah Anderson, not Sophie Wilson." The pieces clicked into place as Dan pursued the Civic toward the industrial district. The girl had nearly said her real name, Sarah, before Wilson corrected her. How many other times had he rehearsed that correction with her? The Civic swerved suddenly, taking a sharp turn onto a service road that led toward the abandoned lumber mill. Dan followed, his tires struggling for traction on the wet gravel.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The old mill loomed ahead, its skeletal structure dark against the stormy sky. Wilson's car fishtailed on the loose gravel, nearly spinning out before regaining control, but the maneuver cost him speed, allowing Dan to close the gap. The Civic disappeared behind the mill's main building, and Dan's heart stopped when he rounded the corner to find the vehicle abandoned, its doors left open in the rain. "Dispatch, suspects have fled on foot at the old Pine Valley lumber mill," Dan reported, drawing his weapon as he exited his car. "Male suspect and juvenile female. Request immediate backup and perimeter setup." The rain had become a downpour, now reducing visibility to mere feet. Dan moved cautiously through the shadows of the old mill, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Water dripped from rusted machinery, and the wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie chorus of metallic groans. A sudden crash from above made him freeze. Footsteps on metal stairs. They were heading for the upper level. Dan followed, his shoes clanging on the wet steel as he climbed. His radio crackled with updates about incoming units, but he barely registered them. All of his focus was on the sounds ahead, on finding Sarah before Wilson could disappear with her again. The upper floor was a maze of catwalks and abandoned equipment. Dan moved carefully, aware that one wrong step on the slick metal could be disastrous. A flash of movement caught his eye, a small figure darting between machines. "Sarah!" he called out, hoping to reach the girl before Wilson could stop her. "Sarah, it's Officer Mitchell. I'm here to help you." A muffled cry came from his left, followed by the sound of a struggle. Dan rounded a large piece of machinery to find Wilson grabbing Sarah's arm, trying to drag her toward a fire escape. The girl was fighting back, her free hand still clutching the backpack as if it contained something precious. "Let her go, Wilson," Dan commanded, his weapon trained on the suspect. "It's over!" Wilson pulled Sarah closer, using her as a shield. "You don't understand," he snarled, his polished facade finally cracking. "She's mine now. I saved her from them." "No one's buying that story anymore," Dan said, inching closer. "Sarah's parents have been looking for her. They love her, and they want her home." At the mention of her parents, Sarah's struggles intensified. She bit down hard on Wilson's hand, causing him to cry out and loosen his grip. In that moment of chaos, the backpack she'd been clutching fell open, spilling its contents across the wet floor, including a crumpled piece of paper with a hastily scrawled message. "Help me. My name is Sarah Anderson." Wilson lunged for her, but Dan was faster. He tackled the suspect, both men sliding across the rain-slicked catwalk. They grappled in the darkness, Wilson fighting with the desperate strength of a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. A punch caught Dan in the jaw, but he maintained his grip, using his training to gradually wear down Wilson's resistance. Finally, the sound of multiple footsteps and shouted commands announced the arrival of backup. Flashlight beams crisscrossed the darkness as other officers swarmed the catwalk. Wilson, realizing he was surrounded, went limp beneath Dan. As Dan secured the handcuffs around Wilson's wrists, he looked up to see Detective Rachel Torres wrapping a blanket around Sarah's shoulders. The girl was shaking, but her eyes were clear and focused as she watched Wilson being led away. "You're safe now," Dan told her softly, kneeling down to her level. "We're going to take you home to your mum and dad." Sarah's lower lip trembled as tears mixed with the rain on her face. Without warning, she threw her arms around Dan's neck, hugging him tightly. "I knew someone would see me," she whispered. "I kept trying to show them I needed help." Dan hugged her back, his own eyes stinging. "You did everything right, Sarah. You're very brave." As they descended from the catwalk, the rain finally began to ease. Emergency lights painted the scene in alternating red and blue, and Dan could hear the approaching sirens of more units, but his focus remained on Sarah, on making sure she knew that her nightmare was truly over. Detective Torres approached, her expression grim. "We'll need her statement, but the paramedics want to check her out first. Her parents are already on their way. They never gave up hope." Dan nodded, watching as Sarah was guided toward a waiting ambulance. She looked back once, giving him a small wave that spoke volumes about her resilience. Something inside his chest loosened. This was why he'd become a cop. For moments like these, when trust in his instincts meant the difference between tragedy and triumph. The old lumber mill stood silent now, water dripping from its rusted bones as the storm moved on. But for Dan Mitchell, the night's events would echo far beyond these walls, a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in life begin with nothing more than a feeling that something isn't quite right. The fluorescent lights of Pine Valley Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across the waiting room as Officer Dan Mitchell sat with his untouched coffee growing cold. His uniform was still damp from the rain, and his jaw throbbed where Wilson's punch had connected. But physical discomfort was the least of his concerns as he watched the parade of doctors and detectives moving in and out of Sarah Anderson's room. Detective Rachel Torres emerged from the room, her notebook tucked under her arm as she made her way toward him. The clicking of her heels against the linoleum floor echoed through the quiet corridor. "Sarah's parents just arrived," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "They're with her now. You should see the reunion. I don't think they're ever going to let her go again." Dan nodded, his mind still processing the events at the lumber mill. "How's she holding up?" "Remarkably well, considering." Rachel flipped open her notebook. "She's already given us some details. Wilson had been watching her for weeks before the abduction. He knew her schedule, her routine, even which piano teacher she actually had lessons with." "The perfect predator," Dan muttered, his hands clenching involuntarily. "He did his homework." Rachel continued, her voice low. "That's not all. We found maps in his car, along with multiple sets of license plates. He was planning to take her across state lines tonight. If you hadn't stopped him when you did." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew how these cases usually ended when suspects managed to cross jurisdictions. Dan stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the restless energy coursing through him. "There's more," Rachel said, her expression hardening. "We ran Wilson's prints. He's connected to at least 3 other missing children cases in the Pacific Northwest over the past 5 years. Different names, different vehicles, but the same MO. He's been doing this for a while." The weight of this revelation settled over Dan like a physical burden. How many other children had Wilson taken? How many families were still waiting for answers? He was about to respond when Sarah's hospital room door opened and Jennifer Anderson stepped out, her eyes red but smiling. "Officer Mitchell," she called softly. "Sarah's asking for you." Dan followed her into the room where Sarah sat propped, up in bed, her father Mark holding her hand, as if afraid she might disappear again if he let go. The girl's face brightened when she saw Dan, and he noticed she was still clutching that worn backpack. "I wanted to show you something," Sarah said, reaching into the backpack. She pulled out a small notebook, its pages crumpled and water-stained. "I kept track of everything, just like they taught us in school. The Stranger Danger Assembly. They said if something bad happens, try to leave clues." Dan took the notebook, his throat tightening as he flipped through the pages. Sarah had documented everything. Street names she'd seen, times of day, snippets of conversations she'd overheard. She'd even managed to draw rough maps of places Wilson had taken her. "That's why I kept dropping things," she explained, her voice stronger now. "I hoped someone would notice, and you did." Mark Anderson cleared, his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "We can never thank you enough, Officer Mitchell. If you hadn't trusted your instincts." "Sarah did the hard part," Dan interrupted gently. "She never gave up. She kept fighting, kept leaving breadcrumbs for someone to find." A knock at the door announced Detective Torres's return. "Sorry to interrupt, but we need to talk about next steps. The DE wants to move quickly on this one." The next hour was spent discussing procedures, court appearances, and the long road ahead. Sarah would need to testify, to relive parts of her ordeal. But as Dan watched her interact with the detective, he saw not a victim, but a survivor. She answered questions clearly, her natural resilience shining through despite everything she'd endured. When Dan finally left the hospital, the night had grown deep and a new wave of rain had begun to fall. He sat in his patrol car for a long moment, listening to the drops hit the roof. His shift had ended hours ago, but sleep felt impossible. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Chief? Yeah, it's Mitchell. About those cold cases Torres mentioned. I want in. There might be connections we're missing. Other families who need answers." The chief's response was immediate. "I thought you might say that. Come by my office first thing tomorrow. We'll put together a task force." Dan ended the call, his determination growing. Sarah Anderson was safe, but there were others out there, other children who needed someone to notice them, to see past the careful facades their captors constructed. Turning the key in the ignition, he pulled out of the hospital parking lot. The city stretched before him, its rain-slicked streets reflecting the nighttime lights like mirrors. Somewhere in those reflections, other stories waited to be uncovered, other truths needed to be brought to light. His radio crackled with routine calls, a domestic disturbance, a suspicious vehicle, the normal rhythm of a city at night. But now each call carried new weight, new possibility. Every routine stop could be the moment that changed someone's life. The rain continued to fall as Officer Dan Mitchell drove through his city, his eyes sharp and searching. Today, he'd learned that sometimes the biggest cases start with the smallest details, a flinch, a hesitation, a name that doesn't quite fit. And he'd learned that courage comes in many forms, including the quiet determination of an 8-year-old girl who refused to disappear without a trace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases to unravel, but for now, he carried with him the image of Sarah Anderson, safe in her parents' arms, her story a reminder that in the darkest moments, hope persists, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to look deeper, to trust their instincts, to make a difference. The night deepened around him as he patrolled, ready for whatever came next, knowing that somewhere out there, someone else might need him to notice what others had missed. The Pine Valley Police Department buzzed with activity as Officer Dan Mitchell pushed through the glass doors, his mind focused on the task ahead. The morning sun barely filtered through the overcast sky, casting a grey pallor over the squad room. Coffee cups littered his desk, evidence of a sleepless night spent poring over case files. Detective Rachel Torres stood at the evidence board, pinning up photos and documents connected to James Wilson's previous activities. Her usual composed demeanor showed signs of strain, dark circles under her eyes, hair hastily pulled back, suit slightly wrinkled from hours of work. 3 confirmed cases, she said without turning around, sensing Dan's approach. Portland, Seattle, and Boise. All girls between 7 and 9 years old, all taken from public places, all involving a man matching Wilson's description, but using different aliases. Dan studied the photographs. Young faces full of innocence, families torn apart. And these are just the ones we know about. Chief Gregory Martinez emerged from his office, his weathered face grave. The FBI is involved now. Wilson's methodology suggests there could be more victims across state lines. They're sending over Agent Kimberly Chen to coordinate with us. The mention of federal involvement underscored the gravity of what they'd uncovered. Dan moved closer to the evidence board, his eyes drawn to a map marked with red pins, indicating Wilson's known activities. "Look at the pattern," he said, tracing lines between the locations. "He never stayed in one area too long, always kept moving, changing identities. These aren't random attacks. This is a calculated operation." Rachel nodded, adding another document to the growing collection. Bank records show he maintained multiple accounts under different names, regular deposits from unknown sources. This goes beyond one predator. He's part of something bigger. The office door opened again, admitting a sharp-featured woman in a dark suit. "Agent Chen, FBI," she announced, striding toward them with purposeful steps. "I've been briefed on the situation. Officer Mitchell, I understand you're the one who made the initial stop." Dan recounted the traffic stop, Sarah's subtle signals, the chase that led to Wilson's capture. Agent Chen listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small black notebook. "Your instincts probably saved more than just Sarah Anderson," she said when he finished. "We've been tracking similar cases across the western states, but the perpetrators are careful. They study their targets, establish credible covers, and move frequently. Getting one in custody is a significant break." The team gathered around the conference table, spreading out files and photographs. Agent Chen pulled up additional cases. On her laptop, more missing children, more grieving families, more leads that had gone cold. "Wilson's not talking," Rachel reported, frustration evident in her voice. "He's lawyered up, won't say a word about the other cases or any potential accomplices." "But Sarah might be able to help," Dan interjected. "She kept notes, documented everything she could. There might be details in there that could connect to other cases." Agent Chen's eyes sharpened with interest. "The notebook you mentioned in your report? We'll need to go through it carefully. Children often notice things adults might miss." The morning stretched into afternoon as they meticulously analyzed every piece of information. Sarah's notebook proved invaluable. Her careful observations included snippets of phone conversations Wilson had made, names she'd overheard, descriptions of places they'd stopped. "Here," Dan said, pointing to one of Sarah's entries. She wrote about another car that would sometimes meet them, a dark blue SUV. Woman driver, red hair. Wilson called her Marie. Rachel quickly cross-referenced the description with their database. 2 months ago, a witness in the Portland case mentioned seeing a child with a red-haired woman in a blue SUV. We couldn't confirm the connection at the time, but now we need to talk to Sarah again, Agent Chen decided. With her parents. Permission, of course. She might be able to identify locations, vehicles, other people involved. Dan's phone buzzed, a text from Jennifer Anderson. "Sarah's been asking about helping with the investigation. Her parents are worried about traumatizing her further, but she wants to do something." The team discussed the best approach, weighing the need for information against protecting a child who'd already been through too much. Finally, they decided to arrange a gentle interview with a child psychologist present and Sarah's parents nearby for support. The hospital had released Sarah, but the Andersons were staying with relatives, not yet ready to return to their own home. Dan and Rachel drove to the house, the suburban street quiet in the late afternoon light. Sarah sat at her aunt's kitchen table, colored pencils spread around her as she drew. She looked up when they entered, her face brightening with recognition. "Officer Mitchell, Detective Torres." She pushed her drawing aside, revealing a detailed sketch of what appeared to be a house. "I've been trying to remember everything about where he kept me." Jennifer Anderson hovered nearby, concern etched on her face. "Sarah, honey, you don't have to do this if you don't want to." "But I do want to," Sarah insisted. "There were other kids' things there, in the basement. I want to help find them." Dan crouched beside her chair, examining the drawing. "This is very helpful, Sarah. Can you tell me more about this house?" Sarah described a remote property with boarded windows and an overgrown yard. She remembered passing a distinctive red barn and a sign for fresh eggs on the drive there. Each detail could be crucial in identifying the location. As Sarah talked, Rachel documented everything, occasionally asking gentle, clarifying questions. The girl's recall was remarkable. Colors, sounds, even smells that might help them locate the property. "There was a lady, too," Sarah added, picking up a red pencil. "She brought food sometimes. She had hair this color, and she drove a big blue car. I heard her talking to him about other kids, where to take them." Dan and Rachel exchanged glances. Marie, the red-haired woman from Sarah's notebook, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. When they finally left, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Dan carried Sarah's drawings carefully, each one potentially holding clues that could lead them to other victims. "She's incredible," Rachel said as they drove back to the station. "Most adults wouldn't have had the presence of mind to gather so much information in that situation." Dan nodded, thinking about Sarah's quiet strength, her determination to help others even after her own ordeal. "We need to make sure her courage counts for something. Those other kids she mentioned, they're out there somewhere, waiting for someone to find them." Back at the station, Agent Chen was coordinating with FBI teams in other states, following leads generated from Sarah's information. The evidence board had grown, new connections emerging as they pieced together the larger picture. A network of predators working together to abduct and transport children across state lines. Wilson was just one part of a larger operation, and Sarah's testimony might be the key to bringing it all down. Dan stood before the board, studying the faces of missing children, thinking about Sarah's drawings and the horrors they suggested. Somewhere out there, other children waited in basements with boarded windows, hoping someone would notice them, find them, bring them home. The investigation was just beginning, but they had something they didn't have before: hope. And as Dan Mitchell prepared for another long night of work, he silently renewed his promise to make that hope count. The red barn stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky, its weathered paint peeling away to reveal decades-old wood beneath. "Officer." Dan Mitchell killed the engine of his unmarked car, careful to stay hidden behind the thick line of trees bordering the property. Through his windshield, he could see the house Sarah had drawn in perfect detail. The boarded windows, the overgrown yard, even the crooked mailbox that hadn't seen a delivery in years. "That's definitely the place," Detective Rachel Torres whispered from the passenger seat, comparing Sarah's drawing to the scene before them. "Look at the distinctive cross pattern on the barn's side. She even got that detail right." Agent Chen's voice crackled through their earpieces. "Teams are in position. Thermal imaging shows at least 6 heat signatures inside the house. 3 appear to be child-sized." Dan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. After a week of intense investigation, Sarah's detailed recollections and drawings had led them here, to this remote property 30 miles outside Pine Valley. The fresh egg sign she'd remembered seeing turned out to be crucial. There were only 3 such farms along this stretch of highway. Marie Thompson's vehicle is parked behind the house, another agent reported. Blue Ford Explorer, matching. The description from Sarah's notebook. The pieces had come together quickly once they'd identified Marie. Her real name was Margaret Crane, and she had a history of suspicious employment at various children's organizations across 3 states. The connection to Wilson proved to be deeper than they'd initially suspected. Bank records showed regular transfers between their accounts going back 5 years. All units stand by. Chief Martinez's voice was steady in their ears. Remember, our priority is the safety of any children inside. We move on my mark. Dan checked his vest one final time, adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. The sun had almost completely set, casting long shadows across the property. In the growing darkness, the house looked even more menacing. Think about it, Rachel murmured, her eyes fixed on the building. How many kids pass through here? How many families are still searching? Before Dan could respond, Martinez's command cut through the silence. All units, execute. They moved like shadows across the overgrown lawn, weapons drawn, approaching. From all angles, Dan and Rachel took the side entrance, while other teams converged on the front and back doors. Through his earpiece, Dan could hear the synchronized countdown. The door splintered under the battering ram's force. Police, FBI, everyone on the ground. The interior of the house was a maze of decay and darkness. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and floors thick with dust. But as they moved deeper into the house, signs of recent habitation became evident. Fresh food in the kitchen, modern locks on certain doors, new electrical wiring snaking along the walls. "Movement in the basement!" an agent called out. Dan and Rachel rushed toward the basement door, following the sound of scrambling footsteps below. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended, flashlights illuminating a scene that made Dan's blood run cold. 3 children, huddled in a corner, squinting against the sudden light. Makeshift beds lined the walls, a table held papers. More forged documents, fake IDs in various stages of completion, and there, trying to escape through a hidden door, was Margaret Crane. "Freeze!" Dan's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "Hands where we can see them!" Margaret spun around, her red hair wild, eyes burning with a desperate fury. She held something in her hand, a remote control. "Stay back!" she screamed. "One more step, and I'll trigger the charges." Dan's heart stopped. Explosives. They hadn't anticipated this level of preparation. Behind him, he could hear agents beginning to evacuate the children, but he kept his weapon trained on Margaret. "Think about what you're doing," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the terror gripping his chest. "Those kids haven't done anything wrong. They deserve to go home." "Home?" Margaret laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. "You don't understand. We're saving them." "Their homes weren't safe. We gave them better lives." Rachel moved slowly to Dan's left, creating a crossfire position. "By selling them? By trafficking them across state lines? That's not saving anyone, Margaret. That's destroying lives." Upstairs, they could hear the continuing raid. More agents securing the house. Margaret's hand trembled on the remote. "You can't stop this. We're everywhere. For everyone you find, there are 10 more houses like this." "Maybe," Dan acknowledged, inching forward. "But right now, we're here. And those 3 children are going home to their families. The only question is whether you want to add attempted murder to your charges." For a moment, the basement hung in perfect silence. Then Margaret's shoulders sagged, the remote slipping from her fingers. Rachel rushed forward to secure her, while Dan kicked the device away. "Device secured," he reported, into his radio. "Basement clear. Send in EOD to check for actual explosives." As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, Dan turned his attention to the makeshift prison. The children had already been evacuated, but evidence of their captivity remained everywhere. Personal belongings, stripped away, replaced with new clothes and fake identities. On a shelf, he found a box of toys, pristine and untouched, as if they were props in a twisted stage play. "Mitchell," Rachel called from near the hidden door. "You need to see this." The door led to a small office, its walls covered in maps and photographs. Red strings connected different locations, creating a web that spanned the entire Pacific Northwest. Names, dates, and amounts were carefully noted beside each connection. "This isn't just Wilson and Margaret," Rachel said, her voice tight with anger. "This is an entire network. Look at these photos. Different houses, different handlers, but the same operation." Dan studied the wall, his detective's mind already making connections. These handlers all use the same method, choosing kids from stable families, creating elaborate cover stories, moving them through multiple locations before final transport. "And look at these manifests," Rachel added, rifling through papers. "On the desk, they're shipping schedules, but coded to look like business inventory. Each number probably represents..." She couldn't finish the sentence. They both knew what those numbers meant. Each one was a child, reduced to a commodity in a ledger. Forensics teams worked through the night, documenting every detail of the house and its grim contents. The 3 rescued children were reunited, with their families amidst tears and desperate hugs. But for Dan Mitchell, watching these reunions only strengthened his resolve. The wall of photos in Margaret's office revealed a network far larger than they'd initially suspected. Sarah's courage in documenting her captivity had led them to this house, these children, this evidence. But it was just the beginning. As dawn broke over the red barn, painting the sky in shades of hope, Dan stood in the overgrown yard, watching agents carry box after box of evidence to waiting vehicles. Each document, each photograph, each carefully coded ledger entry was another thread to pull, another lead to follow. The real work was just beginning. The interrogation room felt smaller than usual as Officer Dan Mitchell watched Margaret Crane through the two-way mirror. Her red hair hung limp around her face, her earlier defiance replaced by a calculating silence. FBI agent Chen sat across from her, files spread across the metal table between them. "We found your ledgers," Agent Chen said, her voice steady. "Every transaction, every location, every contact. The evidence is overwhelming. The only question now is whether you want to help yourself by cooperating." Margaret's fingers traced invisible patterns on the table's surface. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This goes higher than you can imagine." Dan felt Rachel's presence as she entered the observation room. 3 more departments just reported similar cases, she said quietly. "The pattern matches exactly. Strategic targeting, elaborate covers, professional documentation." Inside the interrogation room, Agent Chen slid a photograph across the table. "Tell me about this man, David Reynolds. He appears in your records multiple times." Margaret's hand stilled. A flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed her face before she masked it. "I want a deal. That depends on what you can give us." "Protection," Margaret insisted, leaning forward. "Not just witness protection. I need guarantees. These people, they have connections everywhere. Police, social services, border control." Dan's jaw tightened. The implication of corrupt officials made this case even more complex. Through the glass, he watched Agent Chen consider Margaret's words. "Start talking," Chen said finally. "If your information proves valuable, we can discuss terms." For the next 3 hours, Margaret painted a picture that grew more disturbing with each detail. The network spread across multiple countries, using legitimate businesses as fronts. Children were chosen carefully, not from troubled homes that would draw immediate attention, but from stable families where their disappearances would seem more shocking, less predictable. The psychological aspect is crucial, Margaret explained, her professional demeanor returning. The more unexpected the abduction, the more chaos it creates. While law enforcement focuses on the usual suspects and scenarios, we operate in plain sight. Dan felt sick listening to her clinical description of destroying families. Rachel must have sensed his tension because she placed a steadying hand on his arm. "We need to hear this," she reminded him softly. "Every detail helps us dismantle their operation." Margaret's voice continued through the speakers. "Reynolds handles the documentation, passports, birth certificates, school records, everything needed to move children across borders legally. He has a facility in Vancouver." Agent Chen made notes without looking up. "And the end destinations?" "I don't know specifics. That information is compartmentalized, but there are holding points along the coast, temporary homes where the children are, prepared for transport." The euphemism hung heavy in the air. Dan thought of the basement. In Margaret's house, of children being stripped of their identities, transformed into cargo. A knock at the observation room door announced Chief Martinez's arrival. "We just got a hit on Reynolds. Border Patrol has him attempting to enter Canada at a remote crossing in Idaho." "He's running," Rachel said. "He must have gotten word." "About Margaret's arrest?" "I'm heading up there," Dan decided. "If Reynolds is their documentation specialist, he'll have records of every child they've moved." Chief Martinez nodded. "Take Torres. I'll coordinate with the Idaho State Police, but be careful. If Margaret's right about corrupt officials, we don't know who to trust." The drive to Idaho was tense, filled with strategy discussions and updates. From various agencies, they learned that Reynolds had been stopped but not detained. His papers appeared legitimate enough to avoid immediate arrest. "He's following back roads," Rachel reported, tracking his movement on her laptop. "Staying off main highways. He knows we're looking for him." Dan pressed the accelerator harder, watching the mountain landscape blur past their windows. If he makes it to Canada, we lose our best chance at finding these other holding facilities. Their pursuit led them through winding mountain roads as afternoon faded into evening. Local officers were positioned at strategic points, but Reynolds seemed to anticipate their moves, choosing increasingly remote routes. "Wait," Rachel said suddenly, studying her map. "These roads, they match a pattern in Margaret's files. Look at the sequence of turns, the distances between checkpoints." Dan understood immediately. "It's not random. He's following an established escape route, which means there must be a safe house nearby." They altered their course, following the documented pattern rather than Reynolds' actual trail. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a dirt track through dense forest. "There," Rachel pointed, a driveway nearly hidden by overgrown vegetation. No mailbox, no house number, but the gravel looked recently disturbed. Dan killed the engine and lights, letting the car coast to a stop behind thick trees. In the distance, barely visible through the foliage, stood a modest cabin. A dark sedan was parked outside, not Reynolds' vehicle, but one that matched descriptions from Margaret's files. "Call it in?" Rachel asked, checking her weapon. Dan shook his head. "No time. If he spots law enforcement vehicles, he'll destroy everything. We need to move now." They approached silently, using the lengthening shadows for cover. Through the cabin's windows, they could see movement, someone frantically shoving papers into a shredder. "Ready?" Dan mouthed. Rachel nodded. They burst through the door simultaneously, weapons raised. "Police! Freeze!" Reynolds stood by, his desk, hands still full of documents. More papers littered the floor, and a laptop screen glowed with partially deleted files. "Step away from the desk," Dan ordered. "Hands where we can see them." Instead of complying, Reynolds smiled. It was a cold expression, completely devoid of fear. "Officer Mitchell, we've been expecting you." The sound of footsteps behind them made Dan's heart sink. He didn't need to turn around to know they were surrounded. Margaret's warnings about corrupt officials echoed in his mind as he heard the distinctive sound of multiple weapons being cocked. "I believe," Reynolds said calmly, "we need to have a conversation about jurisdiction." The fading mountain light cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Officer Dan Mitchell assessed their situation. His mind raced through options, each one more desperate than the last. Behind him, he sensed rather than saw the corrupt officers moving into position. "Drop your weapons," a gruff voice commanded. "Both of you, nice and slow." Rachel caught Dan's eye, a silent question in her gaze. He gave an imperceptible nod. They had no choice. For now. Their guns clattered to the wooden floor. Reynolds stepped away from his desk, straightening his tie with meticulous precision. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble, Officer Mitchell, disturbing a delicate operation that's been running smoothly for years." "Smoothly?" Dan's voice dripped with contempt. "Is that what you call destroying families?" A flash drive caught his attention, still plugged into Reynolds' laptop. If it contained what he suspected, records of every child trafficked through their network, it would be worth whatever risk he had to take. "We provide a service," Reynolds said, as if explaining something to a child. "Supply and demand, Officer Mitchell. Simple economics." "They're children, not commodities," Rachel snapped, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Reynolds ignored her outburst, addressing the corrupt officers instead. "Search them thoroughly, then we'll discuss how to handle this unfortunate situation." Rough hands patted them down, removing their phones, badges, and backup weapons. Dan counted 4 men behind them, all wearing law enforcement uniforms from different jurisdictions. The network's reach was even deeper than they'd feared. "Sir," one of the corrupt officers spoke up. "Their vehicle? Find it and disable it," Reynolds ordered. "Check for tracking devices and sweep the perimeter. They may not have come alone." As 2 of the men left to carry out these orders, Dan's mind worked furiously. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before Reynolds would order their execution. The remaining corrupt officers were armed but distracted, their attention divided between watching the prisoners and awaiting further instructions. Reynolds turned back to his desk, reaching for more documents to destroy. In that moment, Dan saw their chance. He met Rachel's eyes again, tilting his head slightly toward the window. Understanding flashed across her face. The crash of breaking glass shattered the tense atmosphere. Dan dropped and rolled as Rachel hurled a heavy paperweight through the window. In the chaos that followed, several things happened at once. The corrupt officers instinctively turned toward the sound. Reynolds lunged for his laptop, and Dan, moving with desperate speed, grabbed the flash drive from the computer. Gunshots exploded through the cabin. Dan felt the heat of a bullet pass inches from his head as he dove behind an overturned desk. Rachel had taken cover behind a heavy filing cabinet, already reaching for one of their discarded weapons. "Kill them both!" Reynolds shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Find that drive." Dan clutched the drive in his fist, knowing it might be their only chance to expose the entire network. He could hear vehicles approaching, the other corrupt officers returning. They were out of time. "Rachel!" he called out. "Remember Mount Hood?" A grim smile crossed her face. "Second floor, Martinez's cabin?" Without another word, they moved. In perfect synchronization. Rachel fired repeatedly, forcing their attackers to take cover. Dan rammed his shoulder into the old wooden wall beside the window, the weakened boards splintering under his weight. They tumbled onto the wraparound porch just as more gunfire erupted behind them. Running full speed, they leapt over the railing into the thick underbrush below. The steep hillside worked to their advantage, gravity pulling them away from their pursuers. "Split up!" Dan shouted as they reached the tree line. "Meet at the fallback!" Rachel veered left while Dan took the right fork, crashing through the mountain vegetation. Shouts and gunfire followed them into the gathering darkness. His lungs burned as he ran, every step carrying him deeper into the forest. The flash drive felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. How many children's fates were recorded in its digital memory? How many families might find answers in its encrypted files? A bullet splintered bark near his head, spurring him to run faster. He could hear his pursuers crashing through the undergrowth behind him, their frustrated shouts echoing through the trees. The terrain grew steeper, more treacherous in the fading light. Dan's foot caught on a root, sending him tumbling down. A short embankment. He landed hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. For a moment he lay still, fighting to breathe. Above him, flashlight beams swept through the trees. His pursuers were spreading out, trying to flank his position. Dan forced himself to move, ignoring the pain in his ribs. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, allowing him to move more quietly now. He needed to circle back, to reach the emergency rendezvous point he and Rachel had established. A new sound cut through the night. Helicopter rotors. But were they friend or foe? Reynolds' network had proven more extensive than they'd imagined. Any approaching law enforcement could be compromised. Dan pressed himself against a massive pine tree, trying to get his bearings. The helicopter was drawing closer, its searchlight cutting bright swaths through the canopy. He needed to make a decision, stay hidden or risk exposure. His radio was gone, taken by the corrupt officers. No way to contact Rachel, no way to verify if backup had truly arrived. The flash drive felt heavier with each passing second, its contents possibly the key to bringing down an entire trafficking network. The helicopter's searchlight swept past his position, illuminating a familiar trail marker barely visible through the undergrowth. Dan's heart leaped. He knew where he was. The old fire road was less than a quarter mile ahead. Moving as silently as possible, he worked his way toward it. The sounds of pursuit had grown more distant, his attackers drawn away by the helicopters. A presence. Finally, the gravel surface of the fire road appeared through the trees. Dan paused, listening intently for any sign of vehicles or movement. Nothing but the distant thrum of the helicopter and the natural sounds of the mountain forest. He was about to step onto the road when a hand grabbed his shoulder. Dan spun, ready to fight, only to find Rachel's familiar face. "Took you long. Enough," she whispered, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips despite their dire situation. "Had to take the scenic route," he replied softly. "Any idea who's up there?" He gestured toward the helicopter. Rachel nodded. "Agent Chen. I had a backup phone they didn't find. She's got a team of vetted agents en route. Reynolds? Still at the cabin last I saw, but those corrupt cops are setting up a perimeter. They want that drive, Dan." He patted his pocket, feeling the small device that could expose years of trafficking operations. "Then we'd better make sure it reaches the right hands." The helicopter's searchlight swept over them again, and this time they stepped into its beam, making the prearranged signal. Above them, the aircraft began to descend toward a small clearing, but they weren't safe yet. The sound of engines echoed through the trees, vehicles on the fire road approaching fast from both directions. "Run!" Dan said, pushing Rachel toward the clearing. "I'll hold them off." "Like hell you will," she grabbed his arm. "We started this together, we'll finish it together." The helicopter touched down as the first vehicle appeared around the bend. Dan and Rachel sprinted for the aircraft, bullets kicking up gravel around their feet. Agent Chen herself leaned out the door, providing covering fire as they made the final desperate dash to safety. Dan's lungs felt like they would burst as he helped Rachel up, then hauled himself into the helicopter. "Go!" Chen shouted to the pilot. The aircraft lifted off, just as more corrupt officers emerged from the trees, their shots pinging harmlessly off the armored underside. As they rose above the forest canopy, Dan finally allowed himself to breathe. He pulled the flash drive. from his pocket, handing it to Agent Chen. "This better be worth it," he said. Chen's eyes gleamed as she secured the drive. "We've got teams moving in on the cabin now. Reynolds won't escape this time." Dan looked down at the mountainside falling away beneath them. Somewhere in that darkness, a corrupt network was beginning to unravel. The flash drive was one piece of a larger puzzle, but it was a start. More importantly, it was hope for countless families still searching for their children. Hope that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. The quiet hum of computers filled the FBI's temporary command center as technicians worked to decrypt the contents of Reynolds' flash drive. Officer Dan Mitchell stood behind Agent Chen, watching lines of code scroll across multiple screens. His body ached from the mountain pursuit, but exhaustion was a distant concern compared to what they might discover. "The encryption is sophisticated," Chen muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Multiple layers of security protocols. Reynolds wasn't taking any chances. Rachel paced nearby, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "How much longer?" "Got it," one of the technicians announced. The screen suddenly filled with folders, each labeled with dates and coded designations. "Beginning data. Extraction now." Dan leaned closer as the first files opened. Spreadsheets appeared, containing rows of information, dates, locations, amounts, but it was the photographs that made his heart stop. Hundreds of children's faces stared back from the screens, each tagged with detailed information about their abductions and transfers. 10 years of records, Chen breathed, scrolling through the data. Every transaction, every transport route, every safe house location. This isn't just Reynolds' operation, it's the entire Pacific Northwest network. The command center erupted into activity as agents began coordinating with law enforcement across 3 states. Maps were pulled up, showing the locations of suspected holding facilities. Phone calls were made, warrant requests expedited. "Look at this," Rachel pointed to a section of data. "Financial transfers through shell companies. Offshore accounts. Some of these amounts." "Money tells the story," Chen agreed grimly. "We're not just looking at trafficking. This is money laundering, corruption, international criminal enterprises." Dan focused on a different screen, where images of familiar faces appeared. "These are the corrupt officers from the cabin. Reynolds kept files on everyone involved. Insurance, maybe. Or leverage," Chen suggested, in case anyone tried to betray the organization. The night deepened as they processed the information, building a clearer picture of the network's operations. Reynolds had been meticulous in his record-keeping, documenting every aspect of their criminal enterprise. "Sir," a young agent approached with a tablet, "we've identified 3 active holding facilities within a 100-mile radius. Teams are ready to move on your order." Chen looked at Dan and Rachel. "You two should get some rest. You've done enough for one day." "No," Dan said firmly. "We need to see this through." Rachel nodded her agreement, and Chen didn't argue. Instead, she pulled up tactical maps of the target locations. "The closest facility is an abandoned summer camp near Lake Morrison," she explained. "Satellite imagery shows recent activity. If we move now, we might catch them off guard." The operation came together quickly. Within an hour, multiple tactical teams were in position around the former camp. Dan and Rachel joined the FBI agents in their assault vehicles, checking their gear one final time. "Remember," Chen's voice crackled through their earpieces, "we believe there are children inside. Precision is crucial." The signal came at midnight. Teams breached the facility from all sides, moving with practiced efficiency. Dan and Rachel followed their assigned unit through the main building, securing room after room. The living quarters were empty, but showed signs of recent use. Fresh linens, warm coffee cups, half-eaten meals. Then they found the basement. "Clear!" agents called out as they swept the underground space. But Dan's attention was drawn to a heavy door at the far end. The lock gave way under the battering ram. Inside, they found what they'd feared: small rooms with bare mattresses, toys still scattered across the floors. But the children were gone. "They must have moved them," Rachel said, examining fresh tire tracks outside, "within the last few hours." "The other facilities," Dan realized. "They're relocating everyone before we can reach them." Chen ordered immediate raids on the remaining locations, but Dan suspected they'd find similar scenes. The network was adapting, moving its victims like pieces on a chessboard. Back at the command center, new data from the flash drive provided a possible lead. A series of shipping manifests pointed to coastal properties used for temporary storage. "They're consolidating," Chen concluded, studying the patterns, moving all their victims to a single location before international transport. Dan traced the coastal shipping routes on the map. "These manifests, they're all linked to a seafood processing company. Perfect cover for moving cargo without scrutiny." Rachel was already pulling up property records. "Pacific Coast Seafood Processing. Owner is Marcus Werner. Multiple shell companies, connections to international shipping firms, and board member of 3 children's charities," Chen added, hiding in plain sight, using legitimate businesses as cover. The pieces were falling into place, revealing an operation more sophisticated than they'd imagined. Werner's processing facility became their primary target, a sprawling complex on a private dock, protected by high fences and security cameras. Surveillance teams reported heavy activity at the site, trucks arriving throughout the night, armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Everything pointed to a major operation in progress. "They're preparing for transport," Chen said during the final briefing. "Ship's manifest shows a cargo vessel scheduled to depart for Asia at dawn. We have to move before that happens." The assault plan was complex, coordinating multiple agencies and tactical teams. Coast Guard vessels would block the harbor, while FBI teams breached the facility. Local police would secure the perimeter, preventing any ground escape. Dan and Rachel joined the main assault team, their earlier exhaustion forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. As they approached the facility, under cover of darkness, Dan thought of Sarah Anderson, of her courage in documenting her captivity. Now they had a chance to save others like her. The first explosion shook the night as charges breached the main gate. Tactical teams swarmed the compound from all directions, encountering immediate resistance. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions as Werner's security forces fought back. Dan and Rachel moved with their team toward the main processing building, using shipping containers as cover. Above them, helicopters swept the area with searchlights, illuminating the chaos below. Through his radio, Dan heard updates from other teams. Armed suspects were being detained, documents secured, but the children remained unaccounted for. They breached the processing plant, moving past empty assembly lines and abandoned equipment. Everything smelled of fish and salt, masking any other sense that might betray recent activity. Then they heard it, muffled sounds coming from behind a false wall. The panels swung open to reveal a hidden corridor leading to the loading docks. Inside, they found them. Dozens of children huddled together in makeshift holding cells. Some had been missing for months, others for years. All were alive. As tactical teams secured the area and paramedics rushed in, Dan watched the children being led to safety. Each face represented a family waiting for answers, hoping for reunion. Rachel touched his arm gently. "We did it," she said softly. "We really did it." But Dan knew this wasn't the end. Reynolds's flash drive had exposed one network, but there would be others. The fight would continue. For now, though, he allowed himself to feel the weight of this victory. In the distance, dawn was breaking over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of hope. The Pine Valley Police Department's conference room buzzed with activity as officers and agents coordinated the massive operation of reuniting rescued children with their families. Photographs and files covered every available surface, each representing a life disrupted and now, finally, restored. Officer Dan Mitchell watched through the window as another tearful reunion unfolded in the lobby. A young boy, missing for 8 months, clung to his mother as she sobbed into his hair. These moments made the sleepless nights and constant danger worthwhile. "Preliminary numbers are in," Detective Rachel Torres said, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. 47 children rescued from Werner's facility. Another 32 from secondary locations we found in the database. 79 families getting their kids back. Agent Chen approached with a tablet displaying surveillance footage from the seafood processing plant. Werner's singing like a canary trying to cut a deal. He's naming names, politicians, business leaders, corrupt officials across 3 countries. Dan sipped his coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. "What about Reynolds?" "Still in surgery," Chen replied. "Took 2 rounds during the mountain pursuit, but he'll survive. We've got agents waiting at the hospital." The door opened as Chief Martinez entered, looking as exhausted as everyone else. "Just got off the phone with the FBI director. This case is officially their highest priority. They're setting up a dedicated task force to follow every lead from Reynolds' files." Sarah Anderson's parents had brought coffee and donuts for the entire department, a small gesture of gratitude that meant more than any official commendation. Their daughter's courage had helped break open a case that would change countless lives. "You should go home, get some rest," Rachel told Dan, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "We've got the paperwork covered." But Dan shook his head, picking up another file. Each folder contained a child's story, a family's nightmare. Some had been missing for years, their cases gone cold until Reynolds' records brought new hope. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A young officer entered, looking uncertain. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important." In the lobby stood a woman Dan didn't recognize, clutching a well-worn photograph. Her eyes held the haunted look he'd seen too often lately, the look of a parent whose child had vanished. "Officer Mitchell?" Her voice trembled slightly. "My name is Laura Chen. My daughter, Maya, she disappeared 3 years ago. I saw the news about the trafficking ring, and I thought maybe." Dan guided her to a quiet corner, taking the photograph she offered. A smiling Asian girl, about 12, stood in front of a Christmas tree. "Tell me everything," he said gently. Laura's story poured out. A normal Sunday afternoon, a quick trip to the grocery store, a moment's distraction. Maya had vanished without a trace. Police investigated but found nothing. The case went cold. "She'd be 15 now," Laura whispered, touching the photograph. "I never stopped looking." Dan studied the image, then pulled up the database they'd compiled from Reynolds' files. What was she wearing that day? Any distinctive features? Purple jacket, butterfly hair clips. She has a small scar on her right wrist from a cooking accident. Dan's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for matches. The database contained thousands of images, documentation of lives interrupted. Then he saw it, a glimpse of a purple jacket, a familiar face. "Miss Chen," he said carefully, "I need you to look at something." The image showed Maya, obviously taken shortly after her abduction. She looked frightened but alive. More importantly, the file contained transfer records, locations, dates. "She was moved through Werner's network," Dan explained, reading the data. "But according to this, she may have been sold to a private buyer in Singapore." Laura's hands shook as she touched the screen. "She's alive. You can find her." "Agent Chen," Dan called out. The FBI agent approached, already understanding what was needed. "We've got another one. International transfer. High priority target." Chen examined the file, her expression hardening. "I'll contact our Singapore office immediately. We've got strong cooperation with their authorities since Werner started talking." Laura sat quietly, tears streaming down her face as she stared at her daughter's image. 3 years. I never gave up hope. Dan squeezed her shoulder gently. Hope's what keeps us going. We'll find her, Ms. Chen. I promise. The next several hours passed in a blur of international phone calls, database searches, and coordination with foreign agencies. Singapore authorities were already moving on locations identified in Werner's files. Rachel brought them updates. Throughout the day, more children were being located, more families notified. The network's unraveling was creating a domino effect across multiple countries. As evening approached, Agent Chen burst into the conference room, her usually composed face bright with excitement. Singapore police just raided a compound outside the city. They found 23 children, including Maya Chen. She's alive. Laura collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Dan felt his own eyes burning as he watched this mother's 3-year nightmare finally end. When can I see her? Laura managed between tears. We're arranging transport now, Chen assured her. She'll be home within 48 hours. Dan stepped outside, needing a moment to process everything. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a beautiful end to a day that had brought so much healing. Rachel found him there, leaning against the building. You okay, partner? Yeah, he said softly, just thinking about that traffic stop, how close we came to missing it all. If I hadn't noticed Sarah's signals. But you did notice. That's what matters. Inside, they could hear more families arriving, more reunions taking place. Each one represented a small miracle, a wrong made right. The task force wants us, Rachel said after a moment. Full-time assignment tracking down the rest of the network. Chen says we've got a knack for this kind of work. Dan thought about it. The case had changed him, showed him a darkness in the world he couldn't unsee. But it had also shown him the power of persistence, of refusing to look away when something felt wrong. What do you think? He asked. Rachel smiled. I think we've got more traffic stops to make. Through the window, they watched Laura Chen making travel arrangements to Singapore, her face glowing with renewed hope. Somewhere across the ocean, her daughter was waiting, alive because one small thread had led to another, then another, until an entire network of evil began to unravel. Dan straightened up, ready to get back to work. There were more files to examine, more children to find, more families waiting for answers. The job wouldn't be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as another family arrived, clutching photographs and hope. Dan opened the door, ready to help write the next chapter in this ongoing story of rescue and redemption. The courtroom air felt thick with anticipation as David Reynolds was wheeled in, still recovering from his gunshot wounds. Officer Dan Mitchell sat in the front row beside Detective Rachel Torres, watching the man whose files had exposed an international trafficking network. Federal prosecutors had spent months building their case, combining evidence from the flash drive with testimony from rescued children and cooperating suspects. The scale of corruption they'd uncovered had shocked even veteran investigators. United States Attorney Catherine Walsh approached the podium, her voice clear and unwavering. Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendant, David Reynolds, was a key architect in one of the largest child trafficking operations ever uncovered in North America. Reynolds stared straight ahead, his face expressionless as Walsh outlined the charges. Conspiracy, kidnapping, human trafficking, money laundering. The list seemed endless. Each charge represented countless shattered lives, families torn apart by a criminal enterprise that had operated in plain sight. From his seat, Dan studied the gallery. Families of victims filled the rows, some clutching hands, others sitting in stoic silence. Sarah Anderson sat with her parents, her small frame, straight and determined. She would be testifying later. her detailed documentation of her captivity forming a crucial part of the prosecution's case. "The state calls Margaret Crane to the stand," Walsh announced. Margaret's red hair had faded in prison, her designer, clothes replaced by institutional garb. Part of her plea deal included testifying against her former associates. Her eyes carefully avoided Reynolds as she took the oath. "Ms. Crane, please describe your role in the organization," Walsh began. "I handled acquisition and temporary housing," Margaret replied, her clinical terminology making several parents flinch. "I identified potential targets and coordinated their initial transport to safe houses. And how did you select these children?" Margaret's testimony painted a picture of calculated cruelty. Children were chosen based on specific criteria: stable families, minimal risk factors, maximum market value. Everything was documented, quantified, reduced to data points in Reynolds' meticulous files. "Mr. Reynolds provided the documentation needed to move them," she explained. "Birth certificates, passports, medical records, whatever we needed to make the transfers appear legitimate." As Margaret continued, Dan noticed Reynolds shifting uncomfortably in his wheelchair. The man's composed facade was cracking as his former colleague detailed their operations. The prosecution presented financial records next, showing money flowing through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. Special Agent Chen testified about the international scope of the investigation, describing raids conducted across multiple countries. The evidence recovered from Mr. Reynolds' files led to the rescue of 112 children, Chen stated. Many had been missing for years. During a brief recess, Dan stepped into the courthouse hallway, needing air. The clinical dissection of the trafficking operation made his stomach turn. Rachel followed him out. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Just thinking about that traffic stop," Dan replied. "How close we came to missing it all. If Sarah hadn't been so brave, if she hadn't left those clues. But she did, and you noticed. That's what matters." They returned as Sarah Anderson took the stand. Her voice was steady as she described her abduction, her captivity, and her efforts to signal for help. The notebook she'd kept, detailing locations and conversations, had provided investigators with crucial leads. "I knew someone would notice eventually," she said, her eyes meeting Dan's. "I just had to keep trying." Reynolds' defense team tried to paint their client as merely a document forger, unaware of the true nature of the operation. But the evidence told a different story. His files contained everything: profit calculations, transfer schedules, even annotations about which children would fetch the highest prices. The trial stretched into its second week. More witnesses came forward: rescued children, reformed conspirators, international law enforcement officers. Each testimony added another layer to the prosecution's case. Maya Chen testified via video link from Singapore, where she was still receiving counseling. Her mother, Laura, wept silently as Maya described 3 years in captivity, moved between countries like cargo. "The documents said I belonged to them," Maya explained, "but I never forgot my real name, my real family." Werner testified as part of his plea agreement, detailing how his seafood processing business had provided cover for international transport. His testimony implicated government officials, border agents, and business leaders who had facilitated the operation. As the evidence mounted, Reynolds' composure finally cracked. During a particularly damaging testimony about money laundering, he suddenly demanded to speak with prosecutors. The plea deal was negotiated over several hours. In exchange for a detailed confession and cooperation in ongoing investigations, Reynolds would receive a marginally reduced sentence. "Let the record show," Judge Miranda Harrison declared, "that the defendant has pleaded guilty to all charges." The sentencing hearing brought more families to the courthouse. They filled the gallery, each carrying stories of loss, grief, and eventual reunion. Reynolds sat slumped in his wheelchair as impact statements were read. Sarah Anderson's statement struck particularly deep. "You thought we were just numbers in your files," she said, looking directly at Reynolds. "But we're not numbers. We're people. We have names, families, lives you tried to steal." When the judge finally delivered the sentence, multiple life terms without possibility of parole, the courtroom remained silent. No celebration, no outbursts, just the collective exhale of families who could finally begin to heal. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Agent Chen as she detailed the ongoing international investigations. The case had exposed trafficking networks across 3 continents, leading to hundreds of arrests and more rescues. Dan watched Sarah leaving with her parents, her head held high. She paused briefly to hug him, whispering a simple thank you before joining her family. Rachel appeared beside him, holding 2 coffee cups. "Task force meeting in an hour. Chen says there are new leads from Werner's testimony." Dan accepted the coffee, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Reynolds was finished, but the network he'd helped expose was vast. Other children were still out there, waiting to be found. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as families dispersed, carrying their mixed burdens of justice and healing. For some, the trial's end marked a chance to rebuild. For others, it was just another step in a longer journey. Laura Chen approached them, her eyes bright with purpose. "Agent Chen says you're continuing to work these cases. If you need any help, Maya and I want to be involved to help other families." Dan nodded, understanding the need to transform pain into purpose. "We could use all the help we can get." As they walked to their car, Dan thought about that rainy night when a traffic stop had changed everything. One small moment, one decision to look closer had unraveled years of carefully constructed criminal enterprise. The task force office waited, filled with new files, new leads, new chances to make a difference. The work would be difficult, often heartbreaking, but necessary. Because somewhere, another child was waiting for someone to notice, to care, to act. Rachel started the engine, glancing at her partner. "Ready?" Dan looked back at the courthouse one last time, then turned toward their next challenge. "Ready." The Pine Valley Community Center buzzed with quiet energy as families gathered for the first meeting of the Missing Children's Support Network. Officer Dan Mitchell stood at the back of the room, watching Laura Chen arrange chairs in a circle. 6 months had passed since Reynolds' sentencing, but the work continued. Maya Chen helped her mother distribute handouts, her quiet strength evident in every movement. The psychological scars of her 3-year ordeal remained, but she'd channeled her experience into helping others. The support group had been her idea. Sarah Anderson arrived with a stack of notebooks. Her mother's publishing company had donated them to the cause. Each one contained safety tips, warning signs, and emergency contacts. She'd insisted on including a section about the importance of documenting everything, drawing from her own experience. "Ready to start?" Laura asked, touching Dan's arm gently. He nodded, moving to the front of the room. The faces looking back at him represented different stages of the same journey. Some were parents of rescued children, others still searched for answers. All carried the weight of knowing how quickly a normal day could turn into a nightmare. "My name is Dan Mitchell," he began, his voice steady. "I'm part of the FBI's Child Recovery Task Force, but I'm here tonight not just as a law enforcement officer, but as someone who's seen both the darkness and the light in these cases." Rachel slipped in through the side door, taking a seat near the back. They'd spent the day following new leads from Werner's continued cooperation, but this meeting was too important to miss. 6 months ago, we uncovered a trafficking network that had operated for years, Dan continued. "We rescued many children, but we also learned valuable lessons about prevention, about awareness, about the importance of community. Laura stepped forward, her quiet strength filling the room. We're here to support each other, to share information, and to ensure no family faces this journey alone. The stories began to flow. Parents shared their experiences. The moment they realized their child was missing, the agonizing wait for news, the struggles to maintain hope. Those who'd been reunited talked about the challenges of healing, of rebuilding trust. Maya spoke about her time in captivity, her voice growing stronger as she described how she'd maintained her sense of self. They tried to erase who I was, but I never forgot. I wrote my real name every day in dust, in steam in my mind. Sarah shared her story of leaving clues, of trying to signal for help. It's important to stay alert, to notice things that seem wrong. Officer Mitchell noticed because he was paying attention. We all need to pay attention. A mother whose daughter was still missing raised her hand, tears streaming down her face. How do you keep hoping? How do you go on not knowing? The room fell silent. Dan thought carefully before responding. Hope isn't just about waiting, it's about acting. Every new lead we follow, every case we investigate, brings us closer to finding more children. The network we uncovered is still yielding information. Rachel joined him at the front, adding her perspective. What we learned from Reynolds's files changed how we investigate these cases. We know their methods now, their patterns. We are better equipped to prevent abductions and find missing children. The meeting continued for 2 hours, alternating between practical advice and emotional support. Parents exchanged phone numbers, formed smaller support groups, made plans to work together on awareness campaigns. Later, as they helped Laura and Maya clean up, Dan noticed Sarah deep in conversation with the mother who'd asked about hope. The woman was nodding, clutching one of the notebooks, something new kindling in her eyes. "She's amazing," Rachel said, following his gaze. "They all are. After everything they've been through, they're still fighting to help others." Outside, the evening had turned cool and clear. Laura locked up the community center, then turned to Dan and Rachel. Agent Chen called earlier. They found another safe house location from Werner's latest testimony. "We know," Dan replied. "Raids planned for tomorrow morning. Want to bet we find more of Reynolds' documentation?" "The gift that keeps on giving," Rachel added grimly. "Every file leads into another piece of the puzzle." Maya touched her mother's arm. "Can we help? Maybe talk to any kids they find? They might respond better to someone who understands." Laura hesitated, protective instincts warring with pride in her daughter's strength. "We'll talk about it. For now, let's focus on building this support network." As they walked to their cars, Sarah ran up to Dan. "Officer Mitchell, Mom says I can speak at the school assembly next week about staying safe, being aware. Will you come?" "Wouldn't miss it," he promised. The parking lot gradually emptied as families departed, carrying with them new connections, new resources, new hope. Dan watched them go, thinking about how tragedy had forged these unlikely bonds. Rachel checked her phone. "Briefing at 6 tomorrow for the raid. You ready for this?" Dan nodded, knowing each operation brought them closer to dismantling what remained of the trafficking network. The work was far from over, but they weren't fighting alone anymore. The community center stood quiet now, but it had become something powerful. A place where isolation turned into connection, where fear transformed into action, where victims became advocates. Laura and Maya were the last to leave, their shared strength a testament to the healing power of purpose. They'd turned their nightmare into a mission, helping others navigate the darkness they'd endured. As Dan started his car, he thought about all the families still searching, still waiting. The support network wouldn't bring their children back directly, but it offered something vital. The knowledge that they weren't alone, that others understood, that hope wasn't naive but necessary. Tomorrow would bring another raid, another chance to rescue more children, to uncover more evidence, to bring more traffickers to justice. The work was endless, often heartbreaking, but nights like this reminded him why it mattered. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. We all need to pay attention. One traffic stop had cracked open an international trafficking ring, but it started with something simpler: the choice to notice, to question, to act. The night deepened around him as he drove home, but Dan felt lighter somehow. In that community center, he'd witnessed the other side of tragedy, the resilience, the connection, the transformation of pain into purpose. The fight continued, but they were stronger together. Every parent who shared their story, every child who survived to help others, every community member who learned to stay alert, they all became part of the solution. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Valley Park as families gathered for the one-year anniversary of the Reynolds case. What had started as a small remembrance ceremony had grown into a community celebration of hope and healing. Officer Dan Mitchell watched from beneath a maple tree as Sarah Anderson helped younger children tie blue ribbons around tree trunks. Maya Chen stood at a podium addressing the growing crowd. Her voice carried clearly across the park, strong and purposeful. A year ago, we were strangers bound by tragedy. Today, we're a community united by hope. Our support network has helped 28 families reunite with their children. We've trained over 1,000 people to recognize trafficking signs. We've turned our pain into purpose. The task force's work had continued throughout the year, each raid and rescue adding to their understanding of trafficking networks. Verna's cooperation had led to operations across 5 countries, dismantling key parts of the international infrastructure that had facilitated child trafficking. Rachel approached, carrying 2 coffee cups. Just got word from Agent Chen. Singapore authorities arrested 3 more suspects connected to Reynolds's files. The domino effect continues. Dan accepted the coffee, watching Laura Chen embrace a newly reunited family. The mother he remembered from that first support group meeting, the one who'd asked how to keep hoping, now held her daughter again, thanks to information uncovered in their ongoing investigation. Sarah's mother, Jennifer, had converted her publishing company's resources to produce educational materials about child safety. The notebooks Sarah had inspired were now standard resources in schools across the state. Her father, Mark, had started a foundation funding counseling services for rescued children and their families. Sometimes I still think about that traffic. Stop, Dan said quietly. How different things might have been if... But they weren't different, Rachel interrupted. You noticed. Sarah fought. We followed the evidence. That's what matters. The ceremony began with a moment of silence for children still missing. Then, one by one, families shared their stories. Stories of loss and reunion, of struggle and healing, of darkness and light. Maya spoke about her counseling work with recently rescued children. They need to know they're not alone, that survival is possible, that their story doesn't end with trauma. Laura described the expanding support network now operating in 3 states. We're building something stronger than fear. We're creating connections that help families endure, heal, and eventually thrive. Sarah's turn at the podium brought tears to many eyes. The shy, frightened girl from the back seat of Wilson's car had grown into a poised young advocate. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, she said. It means you keep fighting anyway, keep leaving clues, keep hoping someone will notice. The task force had evolved too. What started as a response to one case had become a model for similar units across the country. Dan and Rachel trained other officers in recognizing trafficking indicators, emphasizing the importance of trusting instincts and following subtle clues. Agent Chen joined them under the maple tree. Reynolds is talking again, says he's ready to reveal more locations. The pressure from Werner's continued cooperation is making others nervous. The investigation had exposed corruption at levels they'd never imagined. Politicians, business leaders, law enforcement officials, the network's tendrils had reached deep into society's structure. Each arrest led to more revelations, more evidence, more chances to rescue children and reunite families. As the ceremony concluded, families mingled in the park. Children played on swings while parents shared stories and support. The blue ribbons fluttered in the breeze, symbols of hope against the darkness. Dan watched Sarah and Maya working with younger children, teaching them safety awareness through games and stories. Their resilience continued to amaze him. How they'd transformed their trauma into tools for helping others. "Officer Mitchell!" a small voice called out. A young girl ran up, clutching one of Sarah's notebooks. "I learned about stranger danger today. Sarah says you're the one who helped save her." Dan crouched down to her level. "Sarah saved herself by being brave and smart. I just paid attention when it mattered." The girl nodded solemnly. "I'm going to pay attention too, and keep my notebook ready, just in case." As the sun began to set, families gathered for a candlelight vigil. Each flame represented a child still missing, a family still searching, a hope still burning. The support network had given these families something precious, the knowledge that they weren't alone in their darkest hours. Rachel touched Dan's arm. "We've got an early briefing tomorrow. New lead from Reynolds' latest confession." He nodded, knowing the work never really ended. But looking at the gathered families, seeing strength where there had been despair, hope where there had been hopelessness, he knew every effort was worth it. Sarah and Maya approached, their candles casting warm light in the growing dusk. "Ready in for next week's school presentation?" Sarah asked. "We've added a new section about digital safety." Wouldn't miss it," Dan replied, proud of how these young survivors had become powerful advocates for change. The park gradually emptied as night fell, but the blue ribbons remained, gently moving in the evening breeze. They would stay there, reminding the community of both tragedy and triumph, of the importance of staying alert, of noticing what others might miss. One traffic stop had changed countless lives. One moment of attention had unraveled an international criminal network. One child's courage had inspired a movement of hope and healing. As Dan walked to his car, he passed the community center where it all began. The support network's logo now adorned the front window, a blue ribbon intertwined with a rising sun. Inside, the circle of chairs waited for next week's meeting, ready to welcome new families, share new hopes, fight new battles. The night was clear and full of stars as Officer Dan Mitchell drove home, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new chances to make a difference. But tonight he carried with him the image of those candles in the darkness, each one a testament to the power of noticing, caring, and never giving up hope. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.